Hey, welcome back. This is Sweeper3D, and in this part, we're going to be creating the environment around the floating castle that we created in the earlier videos. So this is just going to involve a bunch of sculpting and blocking out the surrounding terrain. So let's get started. All right, so I just grabbed everything and I pulled it above ground level so that I can start making the terrain underneath this. And I brought in a large plane that is going to actually hold the water material, and I extruded it down, but I'll go over why I did that in a little bit once we actually get to the materials for this. And on top of this, I bring in an even larger plane, which is going to be the ground plane. And I'm not really worried about the exact scale of this. I just kind of make it larger than I need, just so I can start sculpting out the environment with enough freedom to work. And then once I figure out the exact setup for the environment, I just go through and delete the faces that are unnecessary so that I can kind of conserve the poly count. I always just find it's a little bit easier to work with more in the beginning and then subtract later on once I figure out what I don't need, than make it too small and have to figure out how to extend it without making some weird topology. All right, so I'm just adjusting the camera right here because now I'm going to get ready to start blocking out the foreground. And right here, I'm bringing in a character as well. So this character is about 5'7". So I'm putting this character kind of in front of the camera where I think the pathway should line up with. And this makes it really easy in a lot of different ways because, well, one, as you can see, I'm starting to pull up the ground, and I can just pull up the ground and match the height of the ground with the height of the mannequin's feet. And then that just makes it really easy to know exactly where to kind of place the ground of the foreground. And then also, just like a general scale reference, now I know kind of how big to make the path, how big to make the environment to kind of match up with the scale of an actual human, and also just a little bit more of a reference point for kind of like what to sculpt around. At this point too, I'm not really subdividing it too heavily. I'm just kind of keeping it pretty low poly and only focusing on the base shape of the foreground, trying to figure out the kind of like the composition of that area as well. And what I came up with was kind of like more of a triangular foreground. What I mean by this is it starts very low on the right side, as you can see, and then gradually kind of goes up in the composition on the left side. And this just helps leave a lot more room on the lower side of the image in the background. So I can see more of the river and more of the kind of ground area in the background. So right now, I'm also just kind of going through and blocking out some hills and some kind of roughed out cliffs with a clay strips brush. And I'm also using a multi-resolution modifier as well for my sculpting. And if you haven't used this before, I highly recommend using this because it allows you to sculpt in much higher detail without it actually lagging. So without this, the most I can usually use is around 1.5 to maybe 2.5 million tries before it starts lagging too much to sculpt. With this, I can go up to sometimes 30 million before it starts lagging. And you can see right here, I also have over 5 million try landscape plane that's just sculpting in real time. So this is super nice to use, and it also gives you control over basically what levels of subdivision you want for the viewport, sculpt mode, and render mode individually. All right, so here what I'm doing now is I'm just going through and deleting all of the faces that I don't actually need on the ground plane, just to lower the poly count because I won't actually be able to see any of this from the actual camera view. So it's just kind of unnecessary having that. And now I can just lower the poly count and sculpt with it being a little bit faster as well. So now I'm just going through, refining everything, and just kind of sculpting in a little bit higher detail now that I know where I want things to be. So again, I'm just using the clay strips brush, a little bit higher on the strength now, so around 0.4. This is just allowing me to get some more kind of cliff-like detail a lot more quickly. And I'm just kind of doing some rough and quick kind of brush strokes as well. As you can see, I'm not being super clean or anything. I'm just kind of going through and just trying to get things shaped where I need to and just kind of being pretty general. And I do this just because in this case, I'm gonna have a lot of trees and vegetation covering a lot of the ground detail anyways. I'm not gonna actually see a lot of this. This is just gonna be what holds most of the assets. So if I was gonna actually have most of this detail be seen, I'd probably spend a little bit longer on making it look perfect and more clean up close, but this is just gonna be kind of covered up by a lot of stuff. So I'm just kind of being quicker. So now I'm just moving on to the left side of the environment. I'm just kind of blocking in some cliffs as well. And I'm just holding control to subtract this in just to make them a little bit steeper too. So generally what I like to do, there's a mix of two different workflows I do when I'm sculpting. I'll do very broad circular strokes to kind of build up the terrain and kind of make these kind of lumpy hills, as you can see right there. And then I'll also do these kind of long side to side strokes as well, just to kind of dig into the cliffs and then also kind of sharpen the tops as well, as you can see. So I kind of just combine those two workflows together just based on kind of what I need to do. So now for the river, what I like to do when I'm sculpting out rivers is, whether I'm adding or subtracting, I like to just kind of do a lot of side to side strokes. And as you can see, that kind of provides a very natural kind of river-like detail. It's very noisy, random, and organic. And I just do that kind of throughout the entire riverside. And on top of that, I'm doing some kind of like smaller kind of round hills with like circular strokes. And back here, I also kind of figured it'd be nice to have kind of like a small cliff, something like maybe 10 to 15 feet tall. And I could just have something like small rocks just kind of like lining up beside that later on. So I'm just kind of making that right there. And then in the background, I'm just kind of making some cliffs and hills too, just kind of making it a little bit less kind of like soft and round like it was before. And then now I'm using the grab brush to kind of just tug things around. And as you can see the composition guides, I'm kind of just pulling that background hill area to kind of line up pretty closely with that first bottom composition line. So I'm just using that kind of as a reference, not like something that I am trying to follow 100%, but I'm just kind of using that to kind of guide where I should put things. And now I just use A&T landscapes just to bring in a very kind of just like a random landscape, just something that's kind of close enough to what I need. And I'm not really worried about exactly which one I choose, just because as you can see, I'm using sculpting tools to actually adjust it. And I just basically use the A&T landscapes just to kind of give me a starting point. It has like that kind of mountainous detail, so it just makes it easier so I don't have to sculpt as much to make it look like a mountain. I can just kind of use the grab brush to kind of just tug things around and position parts into place, and it still looks mountain-like. So here I have the two mountains on the left side and the right side, and then now I'm doing the background one, which is the tallest one, and I'm just kind of moving things around until it looks good, and I'm also kind of referencing the composition guides as well. So this is kind of a general workflow that I like to kind of keep in my head when I'm making a lot of my environments. So generally the bottom three squares on my compositions all have like the foreground, the lower ground area, and some of the midground. As you can see right here, all of that basically lines up within those bottom three squares of the composition guides. And then kind of the bulk of the main detail and like the focal point kind of fits within the middle three squares, which as you can see here it does. And then for the top three squares, that's generally where the least amount of detail is going to be, generally like the framing of the image, the mountain tops, as you can see right here, the tip of the castle, but then most of the sky is going to be right here. So generally up there is going to be a lot of the empty detail. So that's kind of something that I like to do with a lot of my like compositions. I'll just kind of use that as a reference point and not follow this strictly 100%, but kind of use it as a guide to kind of get me to something that looks good a little bit more quickly. All right, so we took care of the background and the middle ground. So now it's time to move on to the foreground and get that more cleaned up and more finalized. So it's very low poly at the moment, as you can see, because it's still connected to the very large terrain. So what I actually want to do is, well, it's kind of a messy workflow, but it works really well for me. So basically in edit mode, I'm just going to go through and select the foreground area that I want to separate. So as you can see, I'm just using the circle select to select that, and then P to separate by selection. So this just allows me to go in and actually subdivide this more finely without actually subdividing the rest of the terrain. So I can actually make this a bit more dense, but not too overly high poly and slow. So I'm just going through and refining the sculpt a little bit more and kind of just using the same workflow as it was for the other parts of the terrain, but just being a little bit more clean. And I'm also about to kind of back up the camera a little bit because I kind of want to see more of the foreground. So I'm just kind of lining that up in walk mode and then using the grab brush to just pull the terrain up until it kind of looks, until it looks right, from the camera view. So now I'm just kind of going through and just kind of adding some hills on the left and right side and just kind of making a little bit more room for the pathway that's going to be going through the center. You can't really see the path too well right now because it's still pretty subtle, but I'm just going to go in and kind of just draw in that general path, as you can see right here. So I'm just holding control and just drawing that in pretty roughly. And in a second, I'm gonna actually go through and subdivide this more. So I'm gonna actually unsubdivide this so that I can add a multi-resolution modifier on here a little bit more easily without it being slow. And now you can see, now when I start sculpting the path, it's a lot more detailed. I'm just kind of doing these very quick side-to-side strokes just to add the pathway, and I find the side-to-side strokes work really well for paths. It just kind of, similar to like when I was doing the river, it kind of adds that natural kind of variance on like the height levels, but I do it a little bit more subtly for the paths. And I'm just kind of going through the rest of the foreground and kind of just carving things in and just adding a little bit more detail. It's going to be mostly covered in vegetation and grass too, so I'm not too concerned on it being perfect or anything. I just need to make sure the height levels are kind of even in certain places and not too crazy or sharp or anything like that. So I just converted that to a mesh so that we could apply the modifier basically. And now what I'm going to do is just start deleting faces that I don't actually need, just to lower the overall poly count of this object and make it a little bit quicker. All right, so this wraps it up for this section. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to NVIDIA Studio's YouTube channel and stay tuned for their new videos. And the next part of this series is going to cover the materials for the environment. So I'm just gonna add the dirt and grass materials, and then I'm gonna also take you through how I set up my water material for pretty much all of my environments. So that'll be the next section. I'll see you guys there.